street, I am told, is paved with pure gold, and the sun it shall never go down. There are ever...
All right, so just the last two verses of chapter 9. Moses and Aaron went into the tent of meeting. When they came out and blessed the people, the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. It's important that we note that it says the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. What it does not say is that the Lord appeared to all the people. There's an exchange back, and we studied Genesis already. There's an exchange back in Genesis. No, maybe it's not in Genesis. Anyway, there's an exchange at one point where Moses asks the Lord if he could see him. I think it is the end of Genesis. And what is he told? Maybe Exodus. What is he told? Right. He said, this is what you can do. You can get the cleft of this rock, and I'm going to cover it with my hand. And it says he passes by and shows him his back parts. But then there's something that's said at the end of that. Why did it have to be done? Okay, Moses says, I want to see you. And God says, well, this is the best I can do for you, because if a man sees me, what happens? He dies. Okay. It's important to notice that this says that the glory of the Lord appeared to the people. This is not the physical presence of God, mainly because God doesn't have a physical presence. God is spirit. It's not even the presence of the Spirit of God in the sense that it's something that can be beheld, because if man looks at God, man dies. It is simply the manifestation of the glory of God. And and I don't want to get too much into this because I'm actually developing a lesson and I don't want to mess the lesson up because it's yet to be preached. When Moses eventually did talk to God, quote unquote, face to face, again, he didn't look at God, because had he looked at God, then he would have died. He was just in the presence of the glory of God. What happened to Moses? He was shining. His countenance was glowing. In fact, it scared the people so much he had to put a veil over his face, or they wouldn't allow him to talk to them. It was a frightening thing. Moses was just a reflection of the glory of God. That aura that existed on Moses after having been in the presence of God was merely, well, does anybody remember, if you're old enough to remember, the little glow in the dark things that used to be so popular back in the 70s? Everything in the 70s was, as phosphorescence is what it is, but everything in the 70s was made glow in the dark. You had glow in the dark t-shirts, you had toys that were glow in the dark, yo-yos were glow in the dark, frisbees were glowing, everything was made glow in the dark. You see some of that stuff occasionally today. Captain Crunch, Peanut Butter Crunch, the best Captain Crunch cereal used to put a little plastic, it was supposed to be the moon, I think, that was phosphorescent. And we played with that when I was a kid. You put phosphorescent toys in light, they absorb that energy. You put them in the darkness, they have absorbed that energy, they then start to emit that energy. That's kind of the way that I conceive of what happened with Moses. Moses was in the presence of the glory of God. That glory radiated onto Moses. Moses then, he didn't create that. It didn't emanate from him. It was a reflection, just like the moon's light is a reflection of the light that comes from the sun. It was a reflection of the glory of God. And that's the best that we can hope for, right? In our lives is to reflect the glory of God, to reflect God's righteousness. Yes, sir.
This came to my mind, made me think of Christ. Although his appearance didn't reflect that glory, his teaching and his way of life did. And so should ours.
Exactly. Now, I tend to, I don't know how his glory was manifested at this point. It almost always artistically is put forth as a glowing aura of light. That is almost always how it's presented. In the Exodus, God's presence was set forth before the people as what? A pillar of cloud in the daytime, but at night it was what? It was fire, it was light. And so light is more often than not something that is associated with righteousness and with God and with good, and darkness is associated with sin and with evil. So that's part of the reason why I think that it's I guess understood that way and portrayed that way by artists who are trying to render an image that looks like it. I don't know that that's how the glory of the Lord appeared. I don't know that it was an emission of light, but I know that whatever this was, it was something that was real and that could be perceived. And we know that because of what happens at the end of the next verse, which is says, when all the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces. And so they react to the presence of God by falling down to the ground. And when it says they fell on their faces, what does that mean? Yeah, they just fell. They prostrated themselves on the ground and as we would say, bowed low to the ground. Not just looked down, but literally got so far down that their face was, what were they attempting to do? Why would someone do that? Fall down and bury their face in the ground? It could be. Fear, I think, is certainly a motivator. And a motivator here, what you're trying to do, why don't you look away from something like that? Why don't we avert our eyes from things? We don't want to see them. It's as if we believe if we can't see them, what? They're not there. So there's an aspect of that we need to understand here. Their reaction isn't a reaction of fear. That's going to become important in just a moment. Now, I skipped over the first half of verse 24. I skipped over the first half of verse 24 for a reason, because I actually believe that is the most important part of these two verses. So the glory of God appears. There is the sacrifice sitting on the altar. And it says, then fire came out from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the portions of fat on the altar. When all the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces. So from the presence of the glory of God comes the fire, and it consumes, and that's what fire does, right? It consumes the sacrifice. These are burnt offerings, right? It's what they're supposed to be. That's what he's taught them. There's going to be these burnt offerings that have to be offered. But at this point, he's only said, okay, you're going to have this fire on the altar and you never let that fire go out. Nothing is ever said about the source of the fire, where it's going to come from. This is where the fire comes from. Where does it come from? God. This is important. Now, it's also important to note that in this, well, I'll get to that in a minute. Let's go ahead and look at the first 2 verses of chapter 10. And then we'll talk about some of the contrasts of what's going on here. Now, Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron. Now, in verses, 23 and 24? In verses 23 and 24, who are the 2 players? Human players. Moses and Aaron. Moses, a good man? Moses, a righteous man? Moses, an humble man? Aaron, a good guy? Yeah. And that's actually can be said for both of them. Moses had his moments, but these are good, righteous men who unlike the people. Now remember, we noted that the people fell and essentially hid their face from God when the glory of the Lord appeared. And we talked about this a lot at the end of last class period, last week. It echoes what happened in the garden. Okay, so you've got Adam and Eve in the garden, and they're without sin, and God, it says, walks with them in the garden, and they talk to God in the garden. They have complete fellowship with one another, and then they sin, and God comes into the garden, and what do? They hide. Why do they hide? Because they're afraid. That's what they said. God actually says, hey, where are you guys at? As if he didn't know. Where are you guys at? He's teaching them. He's teaching them through that question, and they didn't even realize it. Well, we hid ourselves because we were naked and we were afraid. How did you know you were naked? Did you eat of the fruit which I told you not to eat? Well, and what was Adam's response? That woman you gave me, she gave to me and I ate. And then it was the serpent's fault. Shift the blame. Oldest defense in history. When you get caught doing something wrong, blame somebody else for causing it. The big thing is their fear of God and their shame was connected to their sin. Before the sin, there was no fear of being in the presence of God. Moses and Aaron are not portrayed as being afraid to be in the presence of God. What does it say in those 2 verses again? Verse 23. Moses and Aaron went into the tent of meeting. When they came out and blessed the people, the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. The implication there is what was in the tent of meeting when they went in there. The presence of God. In fact, we already know that the presence of God appeared in the tent of meeting. When they finished the tent of meeting, the story tells us that the glory of God came into the tent of meeting and people were afraid to do what? To go down to the tent of meeting. Just a very small handful of people are willing to go down there. The rest of the people stay in their tents. And then there's that one, by the way, he turns out to be a very righteous character as well. Joshua, who says, can I just stay here? Can I just stay here in the tent of meeting with God? And we're starting to see the contrast between people. There are people who like to be in the presence of God, who want to be in the presence of the light because they want to be righteous and they want to have the glory of God reflected in them. And then you have other people who like to be where? In darkness, away from God. And they don't like when the light appears. And this is what we talked about at the end of the class last time. When prophets came into the world, began preaching righteousness, how did the people react to them? They persecuted and killed them. When Jesus came into the world preaching righteousness, how did they react to him? They killed him. Why? Because they don't like the light. We're being given a contrast. You got Moses and Aaron, who don't mind being in the presence of the glory of God. And now we're introduced to Nadab and Abihu, sons of Aaron. They took their respective fire pans, and after putting fire in them, placed incense on it, and offered strange fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. And fire came out from the presence of the Lord. That is the second time that phrase has happened in these 4 verses. Guess how many times you find it in the Bible? Not very many. 2 of them are right here together. Mount Carmel. And by the way, it resembles one of these and then resembles the other one as well. And there's something to be noticed about that. And that's what we want to talk about. So fire comes out of the presence of the Lord for a second time and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. The first time it came out, it consumed what? The sacrifice. Second time it came out, it killed Nadab and Abihu, the priests. One incident, we have a fire that demonstrates an acceptance on the part of God. It's a life-giving fire in that respect, because the sacrifices were to do what? To atone for sins. And so the sacrifices sustained life. So it's a life-giving fire, and it consumes the sacrifice as a sign of God's glory and of God's approval of proper commanded worship. They did exactly what God told them to do. They prepared exactly what God told them to prepare. They put it where God told them to put it. They did everything that God wanted, and God showed his approval by accepting their sacrifice. Yes, sir.
Talking about the manifold wisdom.
Without a doubt. And the lack of wisdom on the part of these 2 men, who rather than do what God said, offered. Now, by the way, let's go to something real quick. Did they offer a strange sacrifice? No. So I have to assume that the sacrifice that was on the altar in this part of the story is exactly the thing that God asked for. Did they offer a sacrifice in a strange place? No, they were right where it was supposed to be, offering it on the altar that God told them to be offered on. Was it strange people offering sacrifices? No, they were priests, and it was their work. So it was the right thing, it was the right place, it was the right people. I'm going to go ahead and say it was the right time as well. Sacrifices weren't offered on a schedule. Well, one of them was the yearly atonement sacrifice. But other than that, sacrifices weren't necessarily offered on a schedule per se. But it wasn't that they were offering sacrifice for something that they weren't supposed to offer sacrifice for. So in that sense, it was the right time for a sacrifice. So we got the right people, the right place, the right time, the right thing. The wrong fire. They didn't fire. Okay, let's ask this question. Have some fun. What is fire? Okay. Chemically, we understand fire pretty well. It is a chemical reaction. That's what it is. It is a chemical reaction, a releasing of atoms, molecules, breaking apart and reforming into different molecules. And then there's energy and light that's emitted as a result of that reaction that's taking place. However, that's about as far as we go with really understanding what fire is, because fire is not a thing. You can't bottle fire. You can't grab fire and hold it. You can't, it's not a thing, but it's not metaphysical either, because it can be seen and it can be measured. It can be perceived. So it's real, it's material. It moves, but it's not alive. The fact of the matter is, fire is a very complex thing. Now, the reason all this is on the top of my mind right now is because when I read fire came from the presence of the Lord, I said, I need to do some looking into this and just see what people think about this, because heaven is not a material realm. And if God is in heaven and fire came from the presence of the Lord, then how could fire be in heaven? Of course, this is accommodative language is what it is. Fire came from God, not literally from heaven. It didn't travel across space and time out of heaven and come down to the earth. It just came from him. He caused it. But with all that I've said, I've simply said this: fire is this fascinating thing that we best can explain as a chemical reaction. Did the fire that Nadab and Abihu provide cause the same chemical reaction that the fire that God provided caused? From a purely material, physical standpoint, yes. So what made it strange? It's unauthorized. Okay. Unauthorized by what? By God. The minute he told them, you maintain the fire on the altar and you get your fire from the altar for these sacrifices, you do not get it from anywhere else. Then any other fire other than the fire that he had supplied in that initial sacrifice was unauthorized. And that's an extremely important lesson. Again, I know I'm saying this a lot for the people that are in this class week after week after week. I know you get tired of hearing this probably. Remember what this book is doing. How can these sinful people be in fellowship with and in the presence of a righteous God? How's that possible? This book is all about teaching us how it's possible for me, who is unworthy to be in fellowship with God, to be able to approach God, to be able to be with God. And here's one of the big lessons. You do what God authorizes to be done, and you don't bring anything of your own with it. Nadab and Abihu brought their own fire. And now we've got fire coming from the presence of the Lord, but it's very different from the fire the 2 verses previous. The fire 2 verses previous was, this is God, this is God's glory. God is satisfied with this offering. This instead is God's fire raining down saying what? This is God's judgment, this is God's wrath, and I am not satisfied with this offering. Both of those things, God's glory, his presence, and his acceptance, and God's wrath and judgment and condemnation, are demonstrated through the same mechanism. fire came from the presence of the Lord. What we need to understand about this is there are some things that we can do that please God, and there are some things that we can do that don't please God. What is the simple difference according to these 4 verses of the Bible? According to these 4 verses, the last 2 verses of chapter 9 and the first 2 verses of chapter 10, what is the difference between doing something that God accepts and puts you into the presence of his glory, or something that God rejects and brings his condemnation upon you? Has he authorized it? Have you brought him what he has asked for? Have you brought it the way, and even something that may seem trivial to a man? Everything else was right about Nadab and Abihu's sacrifice. Only the source of the fire. Does it really matter if your house burns down? Does it really matter whether it was a match or whether it was a lighter or whether it was a firecracker from your neighbor? Does it really matter if your house burns down where the fire came from? Well, what's the end result? You don't have a house. Your house is gone. And I know with forensic science work, they can figure out what caused the fire. So suspend that for just a minute. When the fire is blazing, the house is consumed in flames. Is one of those fires different than the other? No. It seems like such a negligible thing to us, but it clearly matters to God. And what made the fire wrong was not the nature of the fire. What made the fire wrong was that it wasn't authorized fire. So we have to be careful and not say, well, wait a minute. This is just my way of doing this. If it's not authorized, it doesn't please God. It,
Excuse me, for me, what you're saying, I guess, internally directly ties to sprinkling versus submersion baptism.
or any number of other things. Obedience. It's why obedience matters. There's a lot of people out there that want to talk about grace and want to act like that grace covers disobedience. Grace does not cover disobedience. Grace is what makes obedience effective. That's what God's grace does, is it makes the things that we do acceptable to him. Yes.
You know, I did this in your name, I did that in your name. Me, I never do. Somebody can have the best interest in order to do what they believe is right. But like you just said, it comes down to obedience and with all.
Now, building on that, let's add verse 3. Then Moses said to Aaron, we reintroduced the 2 good guys. Moses says to Aaron, it is what the Lord spoke, saying, by those who come near me, I will be treated as holy. And before all the people, I will be honored. I think, I want to say that's from Exodus maybe 30. I don't remember exactly what chapter. Somebody can look it up and tell me how wrong I am. But
Does your version have so Aaron held his feet after that?
yeah, it does. Let's see. Exodus 14, Exodus 30, and maybe Exodus 19. It's pieced together from these statements that are recorded in Exodus. You know what Moses is doing? Moses is remembering what God told them. Moses is remembering what we call scripture. And he turns to Aaron. Don't let it escape your notice. Aaron just lost his 2 sons. And Moses turns to Aaron and says, this is exactly what the Lord told us. That anybody who comes near to me has to treat me as holy. And before everyone, I will be honored. That tells me that offering strange fire was dishonoring to God. And it was treating God as something that is common. God is not common. The worship of God is not common. I realize that in today's world, we are getting more and more casual across the board. When I grew up and came up in school, we were not allowed to chew gum at the schoolhouse, much less eat in a classroom. Eating was reserved to one building in the entire campus. Yes, we did. Today, that is not the case. That is certainly not the case on college campuses. It used to be the case when people went into public in our society. They dressed in a particular way. They didn't just go out in their common clothes. Listen, we got people now who don't even just go out in their common clothes. They go out in their pajamas. The world is making more and more things more and more common. And that is filtering into our worship as well.
That's what I was going to say, Mike. The Brian said about discipline in the school, discipline in the church, not just punishment discipline, but it goes into a larger arena when we think about that, of what's common, what we allow, and how things, or we profane God, or we treat him holy amongst all the people. I think that's important. That's what I'm getting out of this. It's a serious thing. It's a serious thing.
Yeah. Go ahead, sir.
It's going to get worse.
I'm afraid that you may be right. What we need to understand is when we come together to worship, it's not the building that's holy. It's what we are doing that's holy. And if we do not hold respect for who we are approaching and for what we are doing, we are no different than Nadab and Abihu. And our end ultimately is no different than Nadab and Abihu's. It may be delayed. It may not be instantaneous. Theirs was kind of instantaneous. I think I failed to move to chapter 10's slide when I got to chapter 10. You can't really see it very well, but that's Nadab and Abihu laying down underneath the title. Yes. We need to understand ultimately we're going to be separated from God. And that's what this says. Listen, they died before the Lord. That's more than just their physical life. That's the same death that God told Adam and Eve would happen to them the day they ate of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? He said, the day you eat thereof, you shall surely die. Now, they continued to physically live, did they not? So was God lying to them when he said, the day you eat thereof, you shall surely die? No, he wasn't lying to them because he wasn't necessarily talking about their physical death. What was he talking about? That separation that was created between them and God, that made them afraid to be with God, that made them afraid to talk to God, that made them afraid to be in the presence of God. And that ultimately becomes a permanent separation. And the way that the Bible talks about that in the book of Revelation is they calls it what? The second death. And what is the second death characterized as? Being cast into the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, away from the presence of God. How did they die? Fire. What's going to happen to us in the second death? Eternal fire, separation from God. The second death, a permanent death that we can't escape from. And it's really serious stuff. And the reason why these 4 verses are right next to one another are because they are demonstrating to us, on the one hand, doing it the way God asked us to do it gets his blessing and approval in his presence. On the other hand, when we do it our way, it gets his judgment, his condemnation, and death. And then the 2 guys that did it right, one looks to the other and says, this is exactly what God said had to be. If we don't take him serious, and if we don't treat him holy, we will die. And that is a lesson that everyone needs to learn. Shall a man take fire into his bosom and not get burned? That's also a biblical lesson, by the way. Anybody have any questions or comments? It's time to stop. Lord willing, the remainder of chapter 10 will be covered, but it won't be next Wednesday night. It'll be 2 weeks from tonight, because next Wednesday night's the first Wednesday of the month, and it'll be singing night. Appreciate everybody's presence and comments.
I have heard